started. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to today's panel. I'm really excited about the experts we have here today, and I'm hopeful we'll have a really good discussion. I'm Kate Konchnik, and I'm Policy Director of the Environmental Law Program here at Harvard Law School. This is the second in a series of environmental policy panels that we're putting on this school year. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting this one with CERES. For those of you who don't know who CERES is an organization based here in Boston that works with investors and the business community to grow a more vibrant, sustainable global economy. So this is exactly the kind of work that they do all the time, trying to figure out where risks might be and figuring out how we can make safer, more environmental practices also align with economic self-interest. And Monika, who is one of our panelists here today, was instrumental in pulling this panel together, so I really appreciate your help. I just wanted to give a few comments on how this panel came to be, and then I will introduce each panelist. I have very brief introductions which do not do justice to the depth of experience on this panel, but it will just sort of give you a sense of where each person is coming from. They'll each speak for a few minutes, and then we'll hopefully get to a good conversation. Hydraulic fracturing is not a new activity. It's been going on for some decades now, used as a method of natural resource extraction. But its widespread application to shale oil and gas production, combined with deep drilling and horizontal drilling technologies, has really created something quite new. We've got oil and gas development on a different scale and intensity than we've seen before in this country, and in a different geographic distribution. A lot of places that have never seen oil and gas development before now have this in their backyards and in their communities. One stage of hydraulic fracturing is the fracturing stage, where you actually are breaking up rock to release oil and gas. And a lot of water, chemicals, and energy is used to do this stage. And so for a long time, the focus was, and when I say a long time, this boom has only happened in the last decade. This has really gone on the public's radar screen in the last 4 or 5 years. And the public seemed to coalesce around a concern about the chemicals that were being used in the fracturing process. And it's been remarkable. In about 3 years, almost 20 states have passed disclosure laws requiring companies to tell us something about the chemicals that they're using in their fracturing activities. About a year ago, I started looking at some of those laws and have been making recommendations for making sure that those lists of chemicals are more complete and that they are quality controlled, so we know we've actually got accurate lists of what is being used downhole and what is being stored on site. So one of our panelists today, Dr. Boyer, who is a toxicologist, will be speaking to how important it is to know what is on the site when an emergency responder or medical professional needs to treat somebody who's been exposed. But chemical lists aren't enough, and more as I got into this, I realized that there's a lot of other information that would be helpful to know about these activities and about the actors involved in shale gas production, to know where the risks are and to figure out how to mitigate the risks. A lot of people are, this is a very contentious area, so a lot of people are saying that this is safe, we've seen this before, don't worry. A lot of other people are saying there are unjustifiable risks here, we should stop. The problem is a lot of us are taking these positions without a lot of data. So the experts that I brought here today are public and private sector risk analysts. It is their job to figure out where the data is, where we can find the information about these new activities so we can figure out exactly where the risks are and then how to manage them. My hope is that by hearing some of these experts talk today, or all of these experts talk today about the types and sources of information that they usually use to assess risk, we can then have a really good conversation about, are we getting the information that we need about hydraulic fracturing so that we can be making reasoned analyses about whether some of these activities or some of the actors involved are riskier than others. I also thought it was interesting to hear from these risk analysts because this is not like your average consumer product. A lot of times putting things out like lists of chemicals has been really helpful. You put that information in the marketplace, consumers take that information, they run with it. They make new purchasing choices and the market follows. So for instance, people have found out that There's BPA, which is a potential carcinogenic, or maybe we know it is a carcinogenic at this point, in baby bottles. People start buying baby bottles without BPA, and manufacturers respond. You don't have that kind of feedback loop with a natural gas well. You or I could see a list of chemicals that are being used at a single well. That's not going to drive our choices about whether to use electricity, for instance. And so the folks here today, in their various walks of life, take information, could use information about hydraulic fracturing to figure out, where are the safer practices, where are the safer actors, how can we reward them with lower insurance premiums, with loans, with more investment, so that the market is being driven to a safer, more responsible place. And with that, I will turn this over. I'm going to give just a brief introduction before each person speaks. So first will be Dr. Ed Boyer. He's a professor of emergency medicine and the director of toxicology at UMass Medical School. He is a graduate of the Fellowship in Toxicology and Clinical Pharmacology at Children's Hospital in Boston. He has an MD and a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry, and he'll be speaking to us from the perspective of an emergency first responder or medical professional trying to wade through the information about chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing.
Thank you very much. So I'm a medical toxicologist, and we deal with poisonings, overdoses, adverse drug events, the effects of the environment on humans. Like I don't care what, if something's 40,000 times a normal environmental exposure in a lab rat, that's going to be in a lab rat. I worry about what actually happens to people. So we have a different take on things than a lot of other people who practice toxicology as well. Let me just say that the sheet that you have in front of you, the case scenario, was generated by Ike Blom, over in the corner there. Ike is an expert in actual EMS, so if we have any EMS specific questions, I'm going to refer them to him. And I'll just spend more time talking at the interface of things. So, when I as a toxicologist look at this, I wonder a couple of things. First, what's the proportion of drugs and the concentration of drugs and the duration, what's the proportion of chemical compounds, the duration of exposure of chemical compounds, and also the route of exposure of chemical compounds to somebody. It's awfully convenient to think that you have a long laundry list of something, and there might be this one item down here which is horrifically toxic. But you have to understand that when you talk about toxicity, the mere appearance of something does not inexorably lead to poisoning. A well-defined effect is called the threshold effect. People can be exposed for various lengths of time at various concentration by various routes of exposure to a compound without having any toxicity of all if they do not exceed that threshold. So even though something might be present, it doesn't automatically equate to medical problems. The second thing, and the thing that actually worries me or concerns me most about this is sort of the scenario that's put in front of you right now. In the event that something happens on the ground, there are chemicals all about, and the paramedics have to do something. How many people have been to the Poconos? All right, a fair have. Rural, urban, suburban? They're rural, right? They're pretty rural, a lot of them. When you talk about first responders, who's going to be going into a fire ground? Who's going to be going into the site of an injury? Who's going to be going to, like an industrial accident? You have to talk about the paramedics who are going to be working at that particular site. In a lot of these places that are rural, they're volunteer fire departments, they're volunteer paramedic groups who will willingly rush into a field, and that's where the problem lies. We're not talking about the highly trained, exquisitely equipped firefighting forces that say Q8 has or Saudi Aramco. We're talking about what we call in our line of work as the sneakers and jeans crowd. People who just pull on the t-shirt that says, I'm from Barry EMS, while they're wearing their blue jeans going with sneakers. They may not have adequate personal protective equipment, they may not have adequate training. What they have is good intentions, and you need to make sure that these folks don't poison themselves, injure themselves, or kill themselves by inadequate information. So I know that there are ways to get information out to people, and one of the most convenient and one of the simplest is the MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheets. But speaking as a toxicologist and somebody who has to treat folks and potentially think about how to intervene in mass casualty or mass exposure situations, an MSDS sheet may be inadequate. So one of the things that I think has to happen is, how do you get accurate, actionable information to people who have the very lowest level of training? How do we protect that least common denominator? And then the last thing that worries me, or I guess I shouldn't say worry, the last thing that concerns me is, what's the effect of material seeping into the groundwater with protracted exposure? There's a lot of information on some compounds, and there's not much information on far more. And it gets that degree of uncertainty, which I think is interesting from a toxicologic perspective.
And I did forget to say this at the outset, that this panel is actually going to be off the record, and we ask that nobody here attribute statements to the institutions that are represented here. We wanted to do that to make sure we have a good, frank discussion. Next, we have Monika Freyman, who conducts water research at CERES. For those of you who've been looking at hydraulic fracturing work, you may have noticed a report that she published 2 months ago, maybe, about looking at places that are water stressed in the United States and then overlaying that where great volumes of water are being drawn for oil and gas development, and just sort of starting to ask those questions about whether we should be concerned about the water use involved in this activity. Prior to CERES, Monika worked as a research consultant for the Initiative for Responsible Investment here at Harvard. She also was commissioned by the pioneering socially responsible investment firm Trillium Asset Management to help them come up with a strategic approach to entering new and emerging markets with a socially responsible eye to investment. And before that comes from the financial world. So with that, I'd love to hear what Monika has to say.
Thank you, Kate. So CERES has been working for almost 25 years on disclosure and trying to get companies and the business community to be more transparent, to provide more information, especially around social, governance, and environmental impacts. So for example, the Global Reporting Initiative, how many folks have heard of the Global Reporting Initiative? Not bad. So great. So it's a standard now that is used internationally for how companies should report on greenhouse gases, water usage, different employee metrics, and so forth. So that was spun out of CERES, over 20 years ago. And so we continue to really work in this field. And hydraulic fracturing is an interesting challenge, and it's a really sort of put us at the forefront of, this is a classic case that we do need a lot more disclosure and information. And before we can start asking for disclosure, picking up on some of the points that Kate made, I really believe the case is that we need to reframe what we want disclosure about. So the chemicals and the key components around what chemicals are going into fracking is extremely important. So not for a second am I discounting that. But I think the conversation has to be reframed more about hydraulic fracturing is a technology, and it's coupled with this horizontal drilling technology. So taking these two technologies together has allowed us to go to new regions. So regions of the United States and across the world where hasn't been a lot of oil and gas development. So we're moving into new regions that don't have the regulatory structure to handle these new risks of any oil and gas development. We're going into communities next to schools, next to drinking water supplies. So it's a new type of energy development. So you've got the regional component, and you've also got, it's a new type of model of energy development. It's not the classic conventional. It's very, it's a big industrial process. You get a lot of wells, incredible density of wells. There's some counties in Texas that have per square kilometer of county, about 2 kilometers of piping underneath that county. So just incredible density of development, and not only to get the well pads, but you get all the storage tanks for big water reservoirs, or pumping stations, pipelines, new roads. So there's an incredible amount of sort of industrialization that happens around the development. So quite often in my work, I really try to get people to broaden the conversation. So it's not just about fracking. To me, it's really about shale energy development, shale oil and gas. It's not just about natural gas, but we're fracking for oil as well, and that comes with all sorts of new risks. So I think we all have to sort of, the more we can sort of step back and broaden the conversation, the better the conversation and the questions will become. So on the waterfront, that is an area that I really look at. There's other colleagues within CERES that look at methane migration and flaring as well as a really key issue that needs to be solved. But there are many not known, but many risk factors that are pretty acknowledged. So everything from across the whole water cycle, from sourcing, is there enough water, but is there also, what's the competition for water in that particular area? Is the water being sourced from surface water or groundwater? Those are really important issues that we don't have good disclosure on. There's also a lot of risks around how you transport water to a site, how you manage water on the site, and how you mix your chemicals. Are your chemicals coming to you in dry form, where if there is an accident, the spills perhaps are easier to actually contain than if you are transporting a liquid form of chemicals, for example. There's a lot of questions and technical unknowns around, what should the geology look like to be safe to frack? Is there old abandoned wells in the region, especially in Pennsylvania? That can be an issue. Are there natural fracture systems that are interconnected with the formation? How deep are you going versus the aquifer? We don't have enough information about all of those components, so we're really looking for more, disclosure. We want industry to share more of what's going on operationally, and are they doing this sort of pre-site mapping, as well as baseline water monitoring and so forth. So there's a lot of key questions, and I don't want to completely go and give you guys a whole list, but I think one area that's going to come up more in the future is the management of the incredible amounts of the wastewater that come back out of the wells. So there's a lot of this initial flow back water that comes back, and so you're getting a lot of the fracking chemicals back, but you're also getting some chemicals that are associated with the geology, such as some radionuclides that can be a worry, and other compounds that are really hard to treat. So we don't want to just get rid of this water and dispose of it. Sometimes if there's an area that is water constrained, you do want to encourage recycling, but you also really want to encourage the safe handling of that water. So there's a lot of really important disclosure components about how water and wastewater in particular is being managed and disposed of around fracking operations. And I think that issue is going to grow a lot more. So there are, just to sort of wrap up my opening remarks, there are definitely different state databases where there is, some important information on, let's say water permitting or around, spills and accidents, but it's really hard to get good, proper disclosure. And I know Frac Focus is one sort of national database, but it needs a lot of work to really make it much more usable. And there's some good nonprofit work, organizations like SkyTruth and Frac Tracker that are really trying to make that a much better database through their efforts. And but in general, what we're doing from an investor perspective is we're saying, investors, you should be asking this laundry list of questions. But I think those questions should become much more upfront and apparent from kind of public, disclosure with the public and engagement with the communities and regulators in these regions. So that's something that needs a lot more work and an area we're working on. So.
Next we have Chiara Trabucchi, who is an expert in financial responsibility and liability risk management and industrial economics, which is an environmental and economic consulting firm that consults with insurance companies and state and federal agencies, among other clients. Chiara regularly consults to private and public sector clients about financial assurance and environmental disclosures, and has testified a number of times before Senate committees. Chiara.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I have a few kind of opening remarks. I'll keep them very brief because I would like to try and get to kind of a more interactive dialogue amongst all of you and us. Very briefly stated, as Kate said, my background is finance. And where I really work is at the intersection of finance, public policy, and economics. And so what does that mean? It's a great tagline in an elevator, but fundamentally, what do I do? So I often get hired by both private clients and public clients. We maintain a very objective approach. We place no value judgment on the technologies. While we may personally have views on certain technologies, as part of our actual consulting and business practices, we treat each technology exactly the same insofar as there's a physical system that is being erected, and then that physical system interplays with the natural environment in some fashion. And whether it's human health, whether it's environmental, whether it's ecological, or whether it's regional economics, that system will impact its surrounding environment. And depending on scalability, whether it's a narrowly focused system in a particular local economy, whether it's a regional system or whether it's a national system, how it scales and how that system gets translated across different economies matters. And so where I come in to play is I will be hired, or I will consult, or I will opine on the degree to which the operator, the owner and operator of that system, whether it's an actual private entity, whether it's a state or local municipality, or whether it's the federal government, is appropriately hedging the risks of that system. So what does that mean? What we will do is we will look at the prospective valuation of consequences that may occur over time. We will monetize them, we'll put dollar-denominated values on them, and we'll look at phases. And we'll say, in this phase, the risks may manifest in this way. The probability of manifestation may be this percentage. And if it does manifest, here's the actual financial consequence that may arise. And if there is insufficient financing hedge, whether it's insurance, a bond, a trust fund, cash collateral, or self-insurance on the part of the owner-operator, to what degree will the public, the taxpayer, need to absorb that cost to remediate whatever the event was that manifested? So you can imagine it's pretty controversial. We're not loved by some sectors, but we are loved by others, so that kind of balances itself out. Testifying before Congress on this is fascinating and interesting, and that's a conversation for another day. But what we're in the business of is certainty. When you're looking at venture capitalists, when you're looking at financiers who want to invest in new and emerging technology with the presumption that this new and emerging technology, if they're early entrants, will reap a shareholder return and a significant return on investment, they want the certainty, though, that that return isn't going to get denigrated by some future environmental disaster. And so where we come into play is to help introduce certainty, whether it's designing financial responsibility frameworks, designing insurance products, designing trust funds, designing indemnity models. There's a fair amount of discussion with emerging climate change technology that certain technologies warrant indemnification on a state or federal level. Well, what does that mean? What is the taxpayer trading for that indemnification, and where does the risk and the responsibility for the owner-operator begin and end? So I'll just leave you with a final thought, which is I think whenever I talk about technologies like fracking or similar emerging technologies that have a very clear environmental elements that could pose risk, I often find that they also have very clear elements that may enhance regional economies that are otherwise suffering. And so part of the challenge for myself and my team is to develop financing structures that appropriately balance that tension. And I think where you're looking into the future, if I were prognosticating, I think we are going down a path across the United States where you're going to have distributional economic impacts with certain emerging technologies. And I think as a country, we have to decide whether that's okay, whether it's okay to localize certain technologies in certain regions of the country because the economies in those regions need that work, and whether that's appropriately offset in other portions of the country. And I think that's one of the areas that we're looking at in my firm, and we're also looking at the international interplay with China, which is a huge actor right now in emerging technologies, and I can talk more about that at a later date. So thanks, Kate.
Next, we have Granville Martin, who is Vice President for Environmental Affairs, responsible for climate and regulatory policy at JP Morgan Chase. Granville's worked in the financial services area for about 7 years now and has held a variety of positions in state government, including 5 years, I think, as assistant counsel in Governor Pataki's office in New York. His particular areas of expertise include climate policy and environmental issues, including safeguarding New York City's water supply. So, Granville.
Thank you. It's a very old bio. So I lead the environmental diligence effort at JP Morgan for hydraulic fracturing clients. JP Morgan is the largest fossil fuel bank in the world. But before everybody starts groaning, we're also the largest tax equity investor in wind in the US, but that's obviously much smaller than the fossil fuel business. About 2 years ago, we concluded that we needed to get a better grip on the environmental impacts associated with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. We have a retail and commercial banking footprint in about 31 states. This activity is going on probably in 38 states, something like that. We wear a lot of environmental and reputation risk as a consequence of what is going on, and needed to get a clear understanding of where the limiting factors on this growth are. So the kind of financial products that we provide are capital markets, floating equity and debt in the markets. But what really got us motivated to do this was the fact that we are a big commercial bank lender to medium-sized and large companies engaged in this activity. And as a lender, you're exposed over a longer period of time to the operational and economic risk of that company in comparison to the capital markets activity, where you're basically just temporarily holding debt or equity and then selling it into the market. We started this about 18 months ago, the actual process, and developed a questionnaire that covers many of the issues that have been discussed so far. And we sent that questionnaire to about 120 clients that are active in pretty much every formation in North America. And then followed it up with in-person meetings and conference calls to get a little more clarity about what their answers were. And so what did we find? We found a lot. By and large, in our view, the economics of hydrocarbon extraction are pretty well aligned to groundwater protection. The fundamental reality of getting hydrocarbon out of the ground is you don't want water in your well, and that's true for both gas and oil. We, to the disclosure point, spent a lot of time crawling around state EPAs, DECs, state court records, looking for litigation trails about groundwater pollution, and we didn't find a lot. As a lawyer, I certainly didn't see anything that struck me as a sustainable strategy for a plaintiff's firm around pursuing water pollution. Now, there is some litigation around that, but a fair amount of it is been resolved in the industry's favor. Doesn't mean accidents haven't happened. Clearly, some methane migration has happened as a result of poor well design and drilling practices, but it doesn't appear to be a systematic problem as far as we could tell. So by and large, we thought that the economics of hydrocarbon extraction were pretty well aligned with groundwater protection. There are some other issues, however, that I think do pose challenges longer term for the industry. And actually, let me return to the disclosure point. I think by and large, the disclosure that's out there is actually pretty poor. You got to be highly motivated and pretty sophisticated to aggregate the kind of information necessary to come to some of the conclusions we came to, and that's what we were getting paid to do. And the truth of the matter is that most people in the public who are interested in this issue are not being paid full-time to look at these issues. And if public disclosure is to be meaningful, it ought to be accessible. I'm not saying to like the dumbest citizen out there, but somewhere north of the dumbest citizen out there, and it's too far north now. In terms of limiting factors for the industry, water is a big one. You talk to companies even in a state like Texas where water regulation is very, very patchwork and not particularly rigorous. There's real questions about whether or not there's going to be enough water to frack, for instance, a new formation called the Cline out in West Texas. We'll find out. I've been with conservative Texas legislators in at dinner with industry who say, we love you guys, but we're out of water in West Texas, and you're going to have to figure out some solutions. And we're starting to hear from companies. It's something that needs to be watched. I mean, they're in direct competition with farmers. But that's not to demonize the oil and gas industry. I mean, relative to agriculture in almost every part of this country, ag is overwhelmingly the largest use of water, which is good for all of us. But oil and gas is a rapidly increasing but relatively small share. Air emissions, a lot of flaring. It's an issue. Lots of state regulators are trying to get a handle on it. But it's really a political issue. Companies flare because they're chasing oil, and the gas is a nuisance. And when gas is a nuisance, nobody builds pipelines next to your wells to capture the gas. So you have two solutions. One is to vent, which is a terrible solution for the climate. And the other is to flare, which has local air pollution impacts. I think the U.S. is now number 4 on the World Bank's flaring index. So we're going to be number 1 soon. So by and large, look, we like this business. We're not going to back away from it. But we're not blind to the fact that there are some large environmental trends that could jeopardize the industry's social license to operate in a variety of different parts of the country. And the biggest pressures occur where you have high population density and oil and gas extraction. So think of the Colorado suburbs, outside of Pittsburgh, Fort Worth, places like that. That's where the pressure is. That's what we're looking at. And the last thing I'd say is there's the Monterey Shale in California, which is just sort of under LA and going up under Santa Barbara and further north. That is estimated to have 10 billion barrels of recoverable oil, which is more oil than North Dakota's Bakken. And North Dakota is the second largest producer of oil in the U.S. And if the Monterey Shale starts rolling, it is going to be a big deal. So that's all I got.
All right, our final panelist is Andrew Place. He is, are we still calling you the interim executive director?
No, I gave that up.
Okay, so the executive director of the Center for Sustainable Shale Development, which is based in Pittsburgh and is an interesting coalition of industry, several gas companies, environmental groups, and some former state regulators trying to put together a list of industry best practices and then figuring out ways to get companies to want to sign up for this to be certified as doing compliance plus. Prior to, and he's also, he's also at EQT Corporation, one of the gas companies that's involved in this endeavor. Prior to joining EQT, Andrew served in Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection. He's also been a research fellow at Carnegie Mellon. He's now walking a lot better than the last time I saw him. And the last time he had just finished a 100-mile race, so.
On foot.
Yeah. But, Andrew.
Yeah.
It's a short car ride.
Yeah, this was on a bicycle ride, or a car ride, or a horse ride. This was on foot.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I'm sure that mentally I wasn't all there last time we
You had
chatted
your
in
feet
Colorado.
propped up, but otherwise you seemed fine.
All right, good. Yeah, that was a 100-mile endurance race in the Wasatch Mountains in Utah, which was spectacular. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, and obviously we take the disclaimer seriously for ability to speak openly. I'm not speaking for either my firm, EQT, or for the center today, but hopefully that gives us better broadness to have a good discussion. As Kate pointed out, I'm Corporate Director for Energy and Environmental Policy at EQT. We're a vertically integrated natural gas firm, been there for 20-odd years. George Westinghouse is one of our founders. We have an upstream production end, so we see the full life cycle of emissions and risks. So we have our production side doing conventional as well as shale development in the Appalachian Basin. We also have the midstream, so we get to the pipes question, connecting the upstream with the downstream. We also have a distribution firm. We're the gas provider for much of southwestern Pennsylvania, about a third of a million customers. So we also see on the distribution piece, which gets to much of the greenhouse gas discussion about leaky pipes. We have some pipes that are 110 years old in the south side of Pittsburgh. The point is, broadly, we see the risks. We're challenged by the risks. We have to think about the risks. The center's work, we've been at this for 2.5 years. We launched it publicly in March. As Kate pointed out, it's a collaborative, 3 legs of the stool, philanthropy, equally funded by the industry, with environmental NGOs, some globally focused NGOs, Clean Air Task Force, Environmental Defense Fund, regional NGOs, as well as 4 industry partners, Shell and Chevron, the super majors, my own firm, EQT, and Consol Energy, which has, again, a substantial footprint. My firm has 3.5 million acres in the Appalachian Basin, primarily, of course, in the Marcellus, but increasingly in the Utica and Upper Devonian and other shale plays as well. I'm also a farm. I dropped off the planet after undergraduate school and bought a farm in southwestern Pennsylvania in the foothills of the Appalachians. So I get that land stewardship question. I bought the farm for its trees and its waters, 13 springs on the place. The house is spring-fed, has been since the Revolutionary War. So I take that stewardship, and I also find that perspective of help, that I see it not only from my office, the 30,000-foot level, but I see it at the retail end. I'm surrounded on 3 sides by my own firm, which raises some interesting moments. So for me, that's a great perspective. I understand from my management side, thinking about the risks, what are the exposures here. Then I see it from my family and my farm of gathering lines, of well pads around us, questions about truck traffic, what are the risks. So I find that a great salutary value. The CSSD work, the Center for Sustainable Shale Development, is really focused on, centered on the dual imperative. And as Kate pointed out, it's not about safe development, it's about prudent development. And Monika also noted about that this is an industrial process. This is not risk-free. And if anybody tells you it is, you probably shouldn't listen. But there's this duality here, that there's an economic and environmental potential significant upside benefit to this, but there's also a downstream risk that we must do this prudently, and you can't separate the two. And that was the price of entry for all of us to this center's work 2.5 years ago, was you had to understand that those were inseparable. You could not do development from a perspective of social license to operate unless you were challenged by the risk, thinking about the risk, thinking how to mitigate the risk. We set an initial set of performance standards on 2 central risks, ground and surface water, and then air emissions. We are putting in place a third-party auditing protocol. We're going through the first round of certification for the firms this fall and into the spring, so that you have public assurance, not only that you have a standard, but the operators are operating to that standard. Not only through the initial certification, but throughout the full period of certification. That's what gives it credibility in the public space, and as a landowner, that's what gives me credibility, that you're holding up standards saying, yeah, the firm's coming into my community, doing these operations. Are they transparent? Are the standards measurable? Are they operating to a way in which I can understand the risks that I'm absorbing in the community? and it's also focused on, so it's you have the assurance, the audit assurance piece, but it's really focused on risk pathways. And to Monica's point, I wanted to note that it's about really broadening the conversation about risk. And the downhole risk from fracturing fluid is one very small piece, a very important piece, and a public perception flashpoint. But as a landowner, I'm concerned of the broad risks that are out there. And Kate's focused on consumer risk, consumer perceptions, and is there a consumer link to drive compliance or drive environmental performance? My focus, not only for my firm, but also as a landowner, is that the consumer is me, is the landowner, and the consumers, the communities, the regulated community, whether it's local elected officials, township supervisors that have control of the permitting of what's coming into their communities. But it's also the financial community that drives the stockholder value in the firms that do this well, the A students, or penalizes those that don't. And thinking about the standards that we set out, we set to the first set of standards are air and water, as I noted. And that's not the whole risk. There's much more out there that we are concerned about. Terrestrial risks, what's the impact of all this pipe that's going in? Particularly as this development in our region goes into the Appalachian Highlands, which are heavily wooded. What's the impact on species and communities from infrastructure build-out? Induced seismicity, do we cause earthquakes, not only in our production wells, but as we're disposing of wastewater down disposal wells, there's measurable risk. There was a Youngstown event Christmas of last year, clearly associated with disposal wells. So there's other risks more broadly than the air and water we tackled, but our perception of the center was start out with sort of the preeminent risks, air and water, and then broaden over time. But put a line in the sand of the standards are important, and it's pushing the regulatory debate, and it's pushing the debate within the community of the industry. If you, not only, it's having a salutary effect on our peers, on the other operators that are looking at what the centers put out and saying, we're being asked in our communities to operate to standards at least as stringent as the center standards. But also I'm noticing the crossover pollination to the regulatory community that Pennsylvania, for example, is reworking their oil and gas regulations, Chapter 78. And they've pulled in 3 of our 15 standards into that debate. So we find that of value more, the indirect benefits of what this discourse is about, and which is why we've made this public stand, is that it incents activity outside of just the direct implications for firms that are directly involved in the center's work. So in closing, and so we have plenty of time, thinking about the water risk, because as a landowner, I'm concerned about what are those pathways. So off-pad spills. Our center standard requires you have a lined pad. So to ensure that lining there's integrity of that lining, so if there's something spilled on the pad, it doesn't permeate that lining. But if a spill ends up off the pad, is there regulatory reporting, but is there more broadly reporting to the community that could be impacted from that spill? And as a landowner, I want to know what that spill was, I want to know how much that spill was, and I want to know how that was remediated. That's one of the standards we put forward. We also require that impoundment, so you're holding fresh water and wastewater in open impoundments. Are those impoundments in our standards double-lined leak detection? So ensuring that you have real-time understanding of if that impoundment was impaired, if there's a leak in that impoundment. That's an integral piece to ensuring that impoundments don't create significant pathways of risk to groundwater. Closed-loop drilling, so getting away from drilling pits. Historically, you'd have drilling cuttings going into an open pit. We consider those of high risk, so we're requiring the drilling fluids must be handled in closed containment. And then well integrity, of course, ensuring that you don't have communication between the well and the aquifer. But also, I think one of the most important ones for me as a landowner is pre- and post-operations water monitoring. Not only going in before your operations and doing a baseline water from an independent body, but also over time that the onus is on the operator to monitor that water, that aquifer around these pads, and ensure that nothing has changed that's attributable to those well operations. On the air side, I'd be worried about air toxics from condensate tanks. Natural gas liquids can come up with some of these wells, and storing that on site if those tanks are open. You have VOC emissions, you have both the greenhouse gas component, but also air toxic and criteria air emission concern. Our standard requires 95% control of those, and if I was a landowner, that's what I would be concerned about, ensuring that we do have control of those volatiles. And then flared emissions, as it was noted. That we don't vent. I mean, venting would be a safety hazard, an imaginable safety hazard. But flaring, we have a zero tolerance for flaring in production wells. So you're capturing not only the greenhouse gas risk, but you're also capturing the criteria air emissions risk. So all that gas, instead of being burned, is put into lines. You have to have the development lines, the takeaway lines, pipe leaving your pads ahead of the operations, so you don't flare. You aren't required, like in North Dakota, they're well ahead of their pipe by a year or two. And that's why they have a flaring problem in North Dakota. I think 36% of all gas coming up in North Dakota is being flared currently. That's not the case in the Marcellus. Then stationary engines, compressor engines. There's a lot of compression going in. As gas comes off the well, it's going down a line, it's losing pressure. It has to be repressurized periodically every several miles. Ensuring that those engines are controlled and I think transparent. The emissions not only transparent on air modeling, but direct measurement that there's not human health and environmental risk from those compressor stations. And then one that's gotten little attention is also silica dust. Frac sand is silica. And I think there's some good work being done out of OSHA and NIOSH on what's not only the occupational risk to workers, but also to nearby houses. We're working on a standard for, and certainly in my firm, we put bag houses, filters on our frac trucks, so we don't have a cloud of silica dust around. So I think those broadly, as a landowner, those are the risks I'm concerned about. It's the full body risk around my operations. Very much the center is focused on, can we measure these risks? Can we measure what these emissions are? And can we have a transparency that ensures that the landowner has the public confidence that this is a bargain that they're willing to undertake. So anyway, I was long, but hopefully that's helpful.
That's great, thank you.